Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's event. My name's Anthony Isaacs, and I'm the chair of the Friends of Belsize Community Library. For any of you who might not know, the library is a purpose-built Grade 2 listed building in Belsize Park, which has been managed by the Winch, a local charity for disadvantaged children, since the local authority, Camden, relinquished control of the council in 2012. The Friends aim to publicise and support the library, in part by putting on monthly talks. These have been held on Zoom for over a year now, though we do hope we'll be able to return to the library soon. We don't make any charge for attendance at the Zoom sessions, but as the library has no regular statutory funding, we would ask those attending the meeting, if they're able to do so, to make a small donation if they feel so inclined. And I've left a link in the chat, which if you click on will take you to a donation site on the Winch's website where donations can be made. So it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Carol Cooper. Some of you will know Carol Cooper well, obviously. And I'm just going to let somebody else in now. There we go. Carol went to study medicine, but always with the ambition, as I understand it, of living in Hampstead and becoming a novelist. So, excuse me, so she practiced as a doctor, but in fact has achieved all her ambitions, lives in Hampstead, excuse my voice, and writes novels, and clearly is able to use her background experiences and so on to illuminate her novels, and is going to talk tonight about the importance of place, in particular exotic and medical settings. Her latest novel, which I think she's going to read from, is The Girls from Alexandria, which I think relates to her own childhood. She was, I believe, brought up in Egypt. And she's also written a novel about Hampstead, which I think we're going to see the cover of in a moment. And I don't know, I think it's called Hampstead Fever, presumably not malaria, but we shall find out. Anyway, Carol, over to you.
Thank you very much. Big thank you to the Friends of Belsize Community Library, and of course to those of you who are here on Zoom and who haven't gone out to get hammered on St. Patrick's Day night. And I hope you'll feel an awful lot better in the morning for having been here rather than gone out on the town. Anthony's already given the game away, because if you didn't know already, you know now that this goes back nearly 50 years, I suppose, but I dreamt of living in Hampstead and writing novels. And it was a long and very circuitous road, because I was a GP first, and then I did medical journalism, wrote non-fiction books, and before I actually achieved my ambition. And where I lived while I was growing up also has a bearing on what kind of novels I write, because although I was born in London, I was just a few months old when my parents took me to live in Alexandria, Egypt. Not as some Americans think, the one in Virginia, I should point out. My mother was Egyptian and my father British, and we went to live in Alexandria. And I didn't actually return to the UK until I was 18. So I really grew up abroad. And I've also lived in the US and in Switzerland. And I think that all these places now are in my bones. So I'll just get started with, so this is a picture that you should all know quite well, I think, those of you who live in Hampstead. And this is the sort of thing that's inspired me once I got to Hampstead. because, as I say, I've had these other places in my bones, especially Egypt, where I was raised and where half my family is from. Also in my bones, I would say, is the US and Switzerland, other parts of Europe. But once you get to Hampstead, of course, that too gets under your skin and a bit deeper into your bones. And then I found that not only was I living in Hampstead and writing novels, but I also set one of them here, which hadn't been the original plan when I moved here. But, you know, from these pictures, just a little reminder, we're sitting on Zoom, but the beautiful Hampstead is still out there, and how can one not love it and want to write about it? Well, I don't just want to talk. I'm going to be talking about interesting settings and also medical settings. And the reason for that is that, as some of you know, I use both in my books. My 3 novels so far use my medical know-how, but they're also set in beautiful locations. And I think they're integral to the plot. So, for example, in Hampstead Fever, we've got people who are really aspiring to move up in the world, but we also have people who are struggling to pay the very high rents in Hampstead, and perhaps can't always shop in the most beautiful shops that you find in Hampstead Village. So all that has a bearing, but I digress. I'm going to read you, I think, just a short excerpt from The Girls from Alexandria, which has got my most exotic setting so far, and a little bit of a medical angle. And the main character is Nadia. She's now 70 years old. She's in hospital because she's losing her faculties. And unless she finds her sister, she's going to end up in a care home. The snag is that her sister disappeared from the family home in Alexandria some 50 years ago and hasn't been heard of properly since, apart from a few cryptic postcards. So this is the challenge that Nadia has, to find her sister, which she does partly by going back to her youth and partly by other means, which you find out if you read the book. But before I do that, can I just ask, I know one writer is here already. I just want to ask how many of you here are writers? Can't see you all.
Perhaps you can raise a hand in the chat.
Yep. I am. Ronnie,
yes. And who else?
We've got one raised hand, Tracy Mitchell.
Right, lovely.
And then we got Rani came in, so 2.
Great, and I know we've got Jane Davis, whose novels I'm very fond of. Okay, so was that it from the chat? Our writers?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I just want to say that if you're not published yet and you write, you are still a writer. So don't be hard on yourself. This reading is just very short, and actually I'm not going to talk for that long, all in all, tonight. I think I'll probably only talk for about 45 minutes and then let you lot have the floor and ask me whatever you want to ask me. So here's from chapter 1. They drilled into my brain. No wonder my head throbs. I touched my forehead, inching across a mammoth bandage until my fingers reached the top. They said they might remove a flap of skull. Did they, in the end? And what have they done with my piece of bone? They could have lost it. It's funny how the minute you step into a hospital, it's always they and them. Well, now I'm stuck in here, and there's no choice but to trust them. And they'd better figure out what's wrong with me before it's too late. I clutch the sheet, twisting its edge in my fingers. My tongue is dry and wooden, and all I've got is a plastic glass by my bed with tepid water, hopeless for a parched mouth. What wouldn't I give for a cold lemonade served to Simone and me by the mimosa tree in Alexandria? I imagine Rashida calling me, Nadia, my heart, my soul, I made lemonade for you. Here in the ward, the grimy windows don't even open, and the suffocating heat makes my head worse in every way. I may never get out. I picture them splitting my skull apart with a saw that scatters bone dust in its wake. Did the surgeon sink deep into my brain, right down into the catacombs of memory, obliterating the things I need to cling on to? The pulse in my temple gallops at the thought. They might even think up more tests to do. You cannot put a thing past them. They, who are they? And who, for that matter, are we? That question goes back to my childhood, even to my parents' childhood, and still I have no answer. From my bed, I see right into the corridor. There goes the man in the beanie hat thing again. He goes by several times a day. To the prayer room, I guess. The name for his hat won't come for the moment. No surprise. I've begun to struggle with even simple words. The man keeps adjusting his hat as he strides down the corridor. He must know exactly where he's headed. Oh, lucky him. The other day, I found myself at the butcher's when I'd meant to collect a book from the library. A takeya, there's the word for the hat. There's no muezzin in British hospitals, but the man must have an internal clock. Just as a mechanism within my head reproduces the crash of the waves against the rocks. Next door's cockerel, the impatient klaxons at the crossroads, a stray dog barking, the hooves of an exhausted donkey laboring up the hill, the fruity voice of Kulthum on the radio, the penetrating call of the Rababikia man as he trawls the neighborhood for junk, the tram that hurtles from one gloriously named station to the next, shifting its heavy human cargo through Shatbi, Camp Cesar, Ibrahimea, Cleopatra, Sporting, Sidi Gerber, Rushdie, Glimenopolo, and San Stefano, and through it all, Rashida's shrill demand for someone to bring her a knife that is both clean and sharp for a change. The nurse in the dark blue tunic and squeaky shoes is back, dragging a machine on wheels to do what she calls the obs. It checks my pulse, temperature, and blood pressure, while she fits a little clip onto my index finger to measure oxygen. I'm surprised there's oxygen left in this stifling ward, let alone any of it reaching the tip of my finger. All right, Nadia. The nurse's voice suggests minimal interest in the answer. Before I know it, she and her equipment move on to the next patient. I hope that's whetted your appetite, but if not, there's plenty of other things to talk about. And I was just wondering what sort of settings you all enjoy your books to be set in, how exotic and how delightful, and why? Why do we like exotic settings? One reason is, of course, we can't travel as we want to at the moment. But often we read about exotic settings because we hope to go there. We really do hope to go there. Sometimes it's because we're there already on holiday. Sometimes it's because we've lived there. Or maybe we just want to find out something new. So I thought of all those possible reasons. And then I'm wondering, well, why is there such a yen to read things, particularly novels, set in medical situations, hospitals, wards, and even general practices? And because they're not the same reasons, are they, that we like exotic settings? I think TV has a lot to answer for. I think a lot of the fascination with fiction with a medical setting, there's definitely a crossover with TV programs. going back to the old days of Dr. Kildare, if any of you are old enough to remember him, right up to the minute with things like Call the Midwife, and obviously Adam Kay's recent series, which has shocked and delighted viewers, I think, in equal measure. But why is there this attraction? Is it the mystique? Is it because it's a microcosm of life outside? Or is it because, in fact, in the end, we're all going to get ill, or at least we're all going to get old? So I pondered about that. And if anybody's got any bright ideas, please let me know. But the fact is, it seems to be endlessly fascinating. And it's to my advantage for sure. But sometimes I just don't quite get it. However, there's a psychologist called Maslow who may have got the answer. I'm told that he didn't build this pyramid, as it were, but he definitely had a ranking, a priority system of what needs are most important before you go on to the next level. So you're not really worried too much about self-actualizing, writing poetry, painting your house, and so on, unless your more basic needs have been satisfied. And so I wonder if really there's a kind of existential need for things that challenge our being, and maybe that's why medical situations are attractive. It's a bit perhaps like watching something really dangerous, but it doesn't, or scary, like a horror film, but you're watching behind the cushion. So it's not actually real, and it doesn't affect you that much. Still, you do get scared when something goes on the screen in a horror film. We tend to feel fear. We can feel pity for the victims, and our pulses actually race, and we may gasp when something happens on screen. And I defy most people to watch Call the Midwife without feeling some emotion and some cardiovascular response when awful things happen, or when very wonderful things happen. I can't see the chat, so Anthony, I'm going to rely on you to let me know if there's anything I need to attend to there.
Yes, well, I mean, I can just comment if you want to sort of, interact with the chat as it's going along. I should say, because I sort of missed it earlier, that Jane and Lorna were both pointing out that they are writers or novelists at the beginning, so I don't know if they were included, but Jane's written to say that, presumably as an explanation of why people are so fascinated by medical dramas, issues of life and death on a daily basis.
Yeah. I think it's a way of getting, you're up close to your own mortality without getting too uncomfortable. And I have it on good authority that Aristotle was pointed out that you feel pity and you feel fear when you watch a tragedy, but they're at one remove. I had to take it for granted because Aristotle didn't actually tell me this, nor did I read it, but somebody else did. Just not, these horrible things are not actually happening to you, at least not yet. Certainly not perhaps until the next time you go to A&E and then have a frightening experience. So it's a safety of a cushion. We're up against some horrors, but we're not actually happening to us. Now, when I write about a medical situation, I do try to give the inside story. And so on one side of the screen, I've put the kind of romanticized version of what medicine seems to be, certainly in fiction. And of course, the reality is, as we all know at the moment, the NHS is, I don't think it's very controversial to say that it's really struggling and that patients are waiting longer than they should. And vaccination clinics have been going very well, but I put up this little sign of the vax signed to the Vax Clinic, which, as you see, is completely makeshift. It works, but it's hardly glossy Dr. Kildare stuff, is it? But I assume that people want the real story, or as close to the real story as we can get. I was also wondering what sort of medical novels I like, and myself, and I like everything from I read everything from A.J. Cronin to Tess Gerritsen, and I've enjoyed the Doctor and the House books as much as I've enjoyed, although in a very different way, Cancer Ward. And I thought I'd just put a couple of links here for a couple of blogs here for suggestions of good books with medical settings. And in each case, there are a couple of non-fiction books in there as well. But they're really quite interesting lists if you want to have a look. Now, in my mind, and I don't know if this is because I've traveled a lot and lived abroad a lot, but or because my father once told me that being a doctor is the most portable occupation you can have. In my mind, travel and medicine have been linked for a long time. That's not the most original thought, to be honest. The Somerset Maugham Award launched in 1947, and you probably all know that Somerset Maugham was a medic initially, and before he was a very successful novelist. And his award was for writers under the age of 30 who wanted to travel to see the world and to gain experience which they could use in books. And I think some of the recipients have also been doctors. So in my mind, there's also been a little bit of overlap between the two. And I just wanted to I'm going to digress to exotic settings just for a moment, because this is one of my favorite books. I don't know if any of you here would agree with me with that choice. It's been my favorite book for a long time, as you can probably guess from the fact that I paid 3 shillings and 6pence for it. And I've still got it. My handwriting's changed a little bit since then, but I've still got the book, and I marvel actually at how modern the photo on the front is, considering the age of the book. I think it was published in 1958, if memory serves. And I wanted to talk about it because to me, it's a really good example of a book with an exotic setting. The setting is not just there as wallpaper. It does an awful lot of heavy lifting. It affects the characters, and it has a huge effect on the plot. So that was an actual really good example in my mind. And if you remember the book, those of you who love it and have read it several times, as I have, you know that it just couldn't happen anywhere else. It couldn't happen anywhere else because the principal characters wander from a daiquiri in one bar to a daiquiri in the next bar. And there's a very sinister Captain Segura of the secret police. You have a devoutly Catholic population, and you have intermittent electrical connections. So the photo here is actually what I would call Cuban wiring, and it's modern day Cuba, that picture, but it exemplifies what I think of as Cuban wiring. So poor old Jim Wormold in Graham Greene's book had the most terrible trouble selling Hoovers, because if you're living in a city where the electrical supply is entirely haphazard, then very few people are going to buy your product. And at the same time, there are hints of Soviet involvement on the island. And, you know, for all these reasons, it couldn't happen anywhere else. And it also teeters wonderfully, the book teaches wonderfully on a razor's edge between comedy and tragedy, and it's funny, but you know, people die, not always when they're supposed to, shall we say. But I couldn't resist putting the pictures up of Havana nowadays, because I don't think that part of Havana, or the old Havana, has changed very much since Graham Greene's day, and especially not the wiring. And the same goes for my book, The Girls from Alexandria, and it also goes for other books set in Alexandria. It couldn't be anywhere else. So from the point of view of my own novel, it goes back to the 50s and 60s, when Alexandria was a very cosmopolitan place. There were a lot of, there were the haves and the have-nots. That was very marked. But it was also a very friendly community with many, many different people living side by side in harmony. And yet at the same time, you had monumental events like the revolution of 1952, and then the Suez Crisis, and all the other political upheavals. You had, of course, a very active secret police, not so very different to Graham Greene's secret police in Oman and Havana. And you also had the very deep misogyny. So for all those reasons, it was just the right place to put my book. And, you know, it was my home. So that was as what they call a no-brainer. And I really wanted to make the nostalgic angle aspect come alive. So these pictures here are pictures of Alexandria, and they're pretty enough. The main square is the tilted picture in the middle. That's the Cecil Hotel, which most people have heard about. And a lot of people have tried to dig around there, archaeologists, to find, well, one of the things they've been trying to find is the tomb of Alexander the Great, because it's never been found. So you've got the present and the past all mixed up in modern day Egypt. And I just thought I'd put up a few pictures of my own Alexandria, which has informed my book. The book itself isn't about my own childhood, but looking through pictures like this reminds me. So, for example, you have the Greek Orthodox priests in the top left-hand corner, and they were there every Easter, and at other occasions as well. They would come around to the house because my grandfather was well known amongst the Greek Orthodox community, and they were always there. And of course, you'll notice how they were sitting, and the women had to stand. In the top right-hand corner, this is a picture taken at the beach. And when I was a child, the grown-ups were always having fun, and I never quite understood what they were talking about. So for the purposes of my book, I had them saying all sorts of things that could potentially be quite important, but as a child, the main character couldn't possibly understand. The school photo is, this is one of the convent schools I went to. And it was a girls' school, but we had 2 boys in the class, and they were immediately made prefects because that was how it was. They were bound to be, 2 boys were bound to be better than a class of 28 girls. So they just had to be prefects. And the picture in the lower left-hand corner is of my mother, my grandmother, my great-grandmother, and myself in the garden. And, you know, families really were families. The extended family got together often. And it's incredible to think that that used to happen, because in modern day Western world, that just is so rare. And yet this was an everyday occurrence. So all of those things made me think about how I wanted to write the book. It was my Alexandria that I put in, rather than, you know, the picture postcard ones. There have been other fantastic books set in Egypt, and I was very inspired by the Yokobian Building. I'm not sure how many of you have read this. It's set in Cairo, and anybody who comes from Alexandria has a problem with people set in Cairo. It's like the Montagues and the Capulets, or even worse, it's like Oxford v Cambridge. So it's you pretend to hate everybody from Cairo, and everybody from Cairo looks down on the Alexandrians. Nevertheless, that said, I really adore this book. And one of the things that I find interesting is that the Yokobian Building, so the book is about all the characters who are either live in or associated with the building. And it's a real building. And the author, Ala Al-Aswani, is a dentist as well as an author. He actually worked in the Yokobian Building at one point. But his Yokobian Building in the book is not true to life. He's added balconies for a start. And you find writers doing this. They add balconies, they refurbish houses, inspired by, you know, seaside B&B. It suddenly becomes a hunting lodge in some book, or you pick up something that you overhear on the 46 bus, and that snippet of conversation goes into a book, and it's sort of grafted on, if you like. And I remember an author had put some giraffes into a park, a wildlife park, and she felt a little bit guilty because she said, well, there are no giraffes in the park. But, you know, I had to put them there. I felt that there should be giraffes in that park. And she'd convinced herself so thoroughly that when she did go back to the park, she was really surprised to find there weren't any. So it's not a real truth. It's made up truth. And I think that's a great definition of fiction. It's a made-up truth. And I'm going to go into this in a minute in a bit more detail, because I think we've got the author of that quote with us. So fiction isn't necessarily a slavish reproduction, and especially not when you've got a real-life setting. It has to have the ring of truth. It has to be authentic rather than 100% real. And I have Jane Davis to thank for this. We picked bits up and put them in novels, and Jane's T-shirt here reminds people of what could happen if they say something too interesting or do something too interesting. I remember my children used to be quite worried. If they said something and I laughed, they'd say, oh, but mummy, just don't put that in an article. But yes, I want to thank Jane for also saying that fiction is made up truth, because that's one of the truest things I've heard. And I think it applies particularly to fiction that uses real settings. We're not actually using them as such. So if you don't know Jane Davis's novels, then you're in for a treat. At the Stroke of 9 o'clock is one of my favorites. It's set in London, and it's got a scene or two not far from where we are now in Belsize, because the Magdala pub is in it. So I think I love the way she spins the whole world, and it makes you think that it really is absolutely the genuine article, whereas perhaps the house that she's arranged to burn down in her fiction or whatever, it did not actually burn down. Or at least not at that moment. So yes, so thank you, Jane, for the made-up truth, and for warning people they could end up in your novel, or indeed in any author's novel. They were the most terrible magpies. I wanted to just wanted to focus on a personal viewpoint of what to put into novels to make them work, and or what makes the work best. I'm not quite sure how to express that, but I've got some pictures here of Washington DC, and I was prompted to put this up because I ran into a fellow writer who was about to write a book set somewhere where he'd never been before. Now, I don't know if he's planning a research trip there. I really, really hope he is. But he was planning on setting a book where he'd never been. And he thought that YouTube videos and other books might help. And I'm sure they'll help to some extent, but they're not going to put the place into your bones. And ditto, mood boards and so on. I'm not sure that they're enough. They're certainly not enough for me. And memories are great, but only if you remember everything. And I had not been to Washington, D.C. for many years. And I went back a few months ago and took these pictures. And I found that most things were as I remembered them, but I'd forgotten some really important things. So these pictures are, well, 3 of them are taken very close to each other. The Lincoln Memorial and the Vietnam War Memorial, that wall with the names on it, and the Martin Luther King Memorial. They're all within 1/4 of a mile of each other. So it's easy to go and have a look at them. And the Lincoln Memorial is awesome. But anybody can tell you that Mr. Lincoln is huge in that monument, that it's made of marble, that it's awesome, that you get up there and literally your eyes are at the level of his feet. You can get that from a guidebook, but you probably won't have experienced that echoing you get. As soon as you go in, your voice really echoes. With the Vietnam War Memorial, you can see it, you can look at this picture of it, but it doesn't tell you about the hushed silence and the whispers of people visiting as they look for the names of their family members. And Martin Luther King Memorial, actually, I think it's a pretty poor likeness, but that's by the by. It's still an awesome monument. It's got lots of his best quotes around it. But if you go there in spring, the most obvious thing is that you've got cherry blossom falling on your head all the time. So these are things that you don't find in the guidebooks by and large. And then the bottom picture here is a changing of the guard at Arlington Cemetery in front of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldiers. And pretty much everybody who's read the guidebook knows that they change the guard once an hour, that the guard walks 21 steps in that direction, 21 steps back again, etc. And you may also read that you must turn off your phone and stop nattering. But what you don't get is that awesome clicking of his heels whenever he stops after his 21 steps and as he turns. And the way it rings out and echoes. And those are all things, I wouldn't necessarily put them in a book or a short story, but I think those are things that make a setting really real. So I've nearly come to the end of what I was going to say. And one of the things I wanted to mention was about books set in specific locations. So if you're interested in finding a book set in a specific location, then have a look at the Trip Fiction website. And you can actually look up novels. You can search with a location and find books set in specific locations. The other points, they're mostly angled at writers, I would say. Check everything to do with your setting, obviously. Which details do you keep in and which do you leave out? So I would say you probably don't want to describe food in too great detail, because it's going to sound like a restaurant guide or a travelogue. But which details do you keep in? I think an interesting point, which I picked up some time ago, is that it's often the level of casual and unnecessary detail that's the most compelling. Dickens was really good at that, as was Graham Greene. And typically it's Chekhov who said, don't tell us that the full moon is shining, show us the glint on broken glass. So it's those little details that are not the obvious ones. And ditto, I would say, don't tell us that the waiting room's full. Tell us about the nurse who smells of the cigarette she's just had on her break. Tell us about the woman who's clutching her crocodile skin handbag. Tell us about, and it can get quite absurd. So you could have the man waiting in the corridor, and he wants to keep the light out of his eyes, so he's got a towel over his head. And the nursing staff get really upset about that because they can't tell if he's still alive or not. So they keep wanting him to remove the towel from his head. And he lashes out and says, no, 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 the light's bothering his eyes. So detail like that, it's, I think, very telling, and actually much more interesting than the more mundane details one sometimes feel one has to put in because one knows them. How much to explain? I found that really difficult when I was writing The Girls from Alexandria. How much do you take for granted? So, you know, somebody like Nadia, who was born there, who lived there all her life, she doesn't find it particularly strange that the porters at the station carry your suitcase on their shoulders. And she doesn't find it at all strange that women carry full jugs and jars on their heads. They're balanced on their heads, and without holding them, they can walk. She's tried it for herself, and you know, everybody came running to see what she'd broken. But she doesn't find it strange to see people like that. So the point of view of your reader is going to be quite different to the point of view of your main characters. How much do you explain with a foreign setting? And ditto, how much do you explain with a medical setting? Do we need to know what the drip is doing? Do we need to know how much blood has been spilled? I think it's a very good idea to keep it really accurate. And I've got an author, I love his books, but unfortunately he sometimes has arterial blood spurting from the jugular vein, which obviously is completely inaccurate. But anyway, how much to explain? Do you need to explain that it's arterial blood from an artery? How much do you need to tell? And of course, the point of view of your characters matters greatly. And then, of course, in exotic locations, what are you going to do with foreign words and dialects? And I think a lot of readers, even if the location is no more exotic than Hartlepool, they're going to come up against that problem. What do you do about dialect? How much dialect do you use in the dialogue? And you don't want to make it completely incomprehensible. Even if you went to that location, it would be a little incomprehensible to begin with. You wouldn't want to make it too hard for the reader. So what do you do with all of these things? So I think I've come to all I was going to say, but I'm sure that you can bring up things that I've forgotten, things that I've never even thought of. So thank you very much for listening. And I'll happily take any questions. I've mentioned 2 of my books so far. I didn't mention One Night at the Jacaranda. That was mainly set in Marylebone. And so as nice as it is, it's not nearly as interesting as Hampstead. So thank you all for listening.
Well, thanks very much, Carol. Would it be possible for you to stop the screen share? Oh, you have,
yes.
Fine, because
yes.
hopefully we'll be able to see. Right, it has stopped.
You should be able to see everybody.
You should be able to see everybody, and therefore, I think, although people may want to put things in the chat, and I'll read 1 or 2 of them out, I mean, we could also probably engage visually as well by waving hands around. I mean, actual physical hands rather than the electronic ones, if anybody wants to speak. Let me just say what we've got in the chat, which is from Lorna, who early on said, love Tess Gerritsen's books. That may be something to come back to. Jane was saying that is a well-loved book. I think this was with reference to Our Man in Havana, if I remember correctly. It certainly is. And then Jill Fountain says, your Alexandria setting is so convincing, so absorbing, presumably because of the real details you bring to it. And you've talked a bit about bringing real details into things. I just wanted to start off by asking you a couple of questions, really. I mean, one is about medicine and using medical settings. And obviously you start with an advantage because that's an area you've been working in for many years. And I just wondered whether, if that's what you're dealing with, all that comes out of your knowledge, or whether you feel you have to check things yourself from technical literature, medical literature, etc., etc. I'm sort of struck. I know you say don't tell people too much. I think that's probably reasonable. I was thinking about Ian McEwan, who is, I think, quite fascinated in a number of his books with medical procedures, and goes to very great lengths to find out. I think, you know, in my view, probably a bit unnecessarily far, but I recall, I think it was in Saturday, he spends a long time with a neurosurgeon to find out exactly what they're doing in order to be able to illustrate the book. Now, it may be that you might be writing about neurosurgery. It may be that you don't actually practice neurosurgery, I suspect. I mean, to what extent do you yourself refer to medical literature, etc., in order to flesh out your medical settings?
I tend not to. I tend to write what's on my mind and also what's bothering me. So in every one of my novels, I've had a doctor. Usually it's a very stressed GP. And quite often I have, I apologize if anybody here's a hospital administrator, but I usually have an odious hospital administrator. And I quite often have patients who are not being listened to. Because we all know that that happens. So I don't need to look up anything for those situations. I did need to look up a bit of neurosurgery for the Girls from Alexandria, because I write in it about brain biopsy. And, you know, whilst I've been a doctor for many years, I've never actually done a brain biopsy. You know, even with the extended remit of GPs, that's just never been anything I do. So I did have to look something up. I've seen a brain biopsy. I probably didn't need to look it up, but I thought I'd better just check. And then, of course, there are very many wonderful books, like Henry Marsh's books. Very well-known neurosurgeon who wrote Do No Harm. That's not, I think, his most recent book, but he's somebody I admire hugely, and he writes nonfiction. And he's also just been training doctors in Ukraine on how to handle trauma cases. And he's also an eminent neurosurgeon, a fantastic writer. So I've got nothing but respect from him, for him. And I think if one wanted to read up a bit of neurosurgery, I would certainly point them in that direction. But yes, how much do I look up? The answer is not very much, because I write what I know and I write what's bothering me. However, I've never put a real patient in a book.
Right.
I remember one of the most colourful situations I encountered when I was a GP trainee, and of course I can't tell you about it, but I do remember that my trainer said, you're going to put her in your book when you write about general practice, aren't you? And I said yes, because I was a trainee and you say yes to everything that the trainer tells you. But of course, that would be completely unethical, and I couldn't do that.
Right. There's a question from Rani Barr, who's one of our committee members, and Rani was also pointed out to me. I mean, I think she mentioned earlier on that she was a writer, but just to say that she is writing her second novel and waiting to hear from the publishers about her first. So good luck, Rani. But she's just asking, who is your publisher?
Well, I've self-published my first one, and I made a lot of mistakes with it. And I actually had to unpublish it and republish it with a decent, a more beautiful, more professional cover design. But my publisher now is Agora Books, which is a small independent publisher in London.
Thank you.
So
Gail,
are you with a publisher at the moment?
Oh, Rani, do you want to come in?
Actually, I've sent off to several publishers and agents, and I'm waiting to hear. Also, I was interested, would you classify your book as auto-fiction?
No,
Because
it's fiction. It's purely fiction.
It's just fiction.
But I mean, I plunder the situations that I know.
Right.
But
yeah, same with my novel. That's what I have done.
Well, okay, you know, I've got NASA giving a speech in 1956. Okay, yes, he gave a speech in 1956, but the rest of it, my characters, everything, my characters are not real, and everything that's happening to them is made up. So
yes. I see, right.
Public figures are real, but everything else is made up completely.
This is fiction, right?
And are your books set in an exotic setting or not?
I'm from Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as it is now. So I have, like you, I have made use of that. It's set in Ceylon as well as London, particularly Belsize Park.
Right. So we have something in common there.
Yeah, well, having mentioned two exotic settings, Rani, it might be interesting for people to know, is actually joining us from Mexico. So
right.
absolutely at the moment.
Mexico, and my second
so
book.
Maybe you'll set one of your books there.
Set in Mexico.
Right.
Carol, can I ask a question? Actually, I'm not sure if it's a question, more of an observation, but just when we're talking about exotic settings, you know, it strikes me that you're writing about Nadia from a hospital bed in London, which is not home, and it's as if the country feels quite alien to her still. So while we, the reader, are thinking of Alexandria as being exotic, actually for her, Alexandria is home, and it's actually a reversal situation. So we've got, for some people, what's exotic is home, and then for some people, what's exotic is actually alien to them. And she's kind of battling against that background, really, still feeling the same us and them that she does with the medical team and her, with, I think, the people she's in contact with in Britain.
I think you're right. I think as the book develops, she feels more at home here. And because she also appreciates that, you know, you can have all this nostalgia for where you grew up, where you're from, but it's, you know, you need to have your eyes open sometimes and see that there were some pretty bad things about it. And that's one of the reasons I don't particularly like going back to Egypt. I don't particularly appreciate the misogyny. And it's something that Nadia in the book, she begins to appreciate the UK more, certainly London more.
I suppose the thing about exotic settings is we're talking about it from the point of view of the reader rather than the character in the novel, who obviously doesn't find it exotic at all, if that's normal sort of habitat, as it were. But
Exactly. But the thing is, it's the reader's point of view one writes for the reader.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
I could have written something really mushy about my childhood in Alexandria, but I decided not to. I decided just to use some impressions and memories as the backdrop, and set the story there, because I thought that's really the only place such a story could be set. But yes, it's funny. It was not exotic to me when I was growing up there, and that's one of the reasons I said, well, don't put in too much detail. It depends on the point of view of the characters in the novel. When I left Egypt and went to the United States with my mother, I thought the US was really exotic. I think we went to Cleveland. I thought Cleveland was really exotic. I don't think anybody in Cleveland would think that.
No, I suppose it's the unfamiliarity. But there are some places I think people from here would find genuinely exotic. And I was thinking that in terms of combining sort of medical settings and an exotic setting, you couldn't do better than something that I've been glued to since it started on television, I don't know, a few years ago, and third series has just concluded, which is The Good Karma Hospital. I don't know if any other people have seen that, but I think it's not a brilliant work of fiction, but it's set in a very beautiful setting. It's a rather basic sort of hospital, which is supposed to be set in Kerala. Interestingly, it wasn't filmed in Kerala at all. It was filmed in Galle, which is in Sri Lanka, which Rani will know well, and which is a wonderful place, actually. And the thing about the hospital is that it's not quite the Dr. Kildare sort of stuff, really. I mean, things tend to be more mundane. You can more easily identify, I think, with things that are going on there, because this is just happening in somewhere that is not the most technically advanced hospital in the world, and yet the characters are incredibly engaging, which is another part of it. And of course, there's an on-off love interest in the thing as well, which adds greatly to one's fascination with the plot and how it's all going to work out. So anyway, I recommend that. You can probably pick it up on ITV Hub or something, I think, if you haven't seen it. But nice to get stuck into.
It's shown from now and again. It's shown on, can't remember which channels as well.
Well, it was 4, and then the last one was on ITV. So whether they've got the whole series, I don't know, but I imagine they've certainly got the third one. But it helps to see it from the beginning, I think, see how the characters develop. Anyway, yes. That's sort of bit by the by. Gail had just written a little note in the chat to say, thank you, Carol, for a very interesting talk. Not having been to Washington, D.C., I found the descriptions of the Lincoln and Vietnam memorials really illuminating. Gail's still there. I don't know whether you want to come in and say anything more, Gail, but yes, I mean, I've seen those. It is, sort of remarkable setting, the whole of that area, actually. But I think the points you make are particularly well made, really, about the things that you don't get from the guidebooks, the sounds, if you like, and so on. Yes, so quite different.
Yes,
anyway.
And you can even get smell and taste. I was going to say, in Egypt, when there's a Hamsin wind from blowing across the Sahara, you can actually taste it. You don't just see the dust the dust that we've been having just lately. It's actually a yellower dust, and it also tastes rancid, and it irritates your eyes. There's so much of it. But if you read about the Hamsin wind, you probably wouldn't get that from a non-fiction book. It would tell you, don't go there in April because you might not get the full multi-sensory experience, shall we say.
Has anybody got any other thoughts or anything in
Gail
that line?
hasn't been to Washington, DC, just to say I think I can heartily recommend it. I love it more now than when I lived there, and I'm actually hoping to go there again at the end of the month.
The museums are worth seeing as well, I think, in addition to these various monuments.
Absolutely.
Right. Any other authors want to contribute any thoughts of their own, or?
I was going to ask of the other authors, actually, how much research is right, and how do they do it if they need to research settings? Or are they a bit like me and they don't research them as such, they live them?
I didn't do any research, just like you, just remembering from memory.
I go to places with a notebook and pen. I mean, even places that I'm quite familiar with. And some of the experiences on the particular days, I've got a book that's got a scene in Richmond Park. And I know Richmond Park very well. I go walking in there quite often. But the particular day I went with my notebook for my research, I wanted to walk a park called the Queen's Walk that goes up towards the Royal School of Ballet. And it was deer ratting season, and it just hadn't struck me that it was deer ratting season. I was on my own, and every few steps, what you thought was branches of a tree off an old log stood up, and it was a great big stag. And I came face to face with one of these beasts really close to me. And those sorts of scenes do actually end up in the novel because you have an emotional response to them. So even though that hadn't happened to me at any time other than the time I went for my research, so bits and pieces like that end up there. And the King's Road, which I knew very well, I don't think when you're walking it down it ordinarily, it's when you're talking about how much detail to put in, I don't take in, you don't take in the detail because it's ordinary. So you need to go back there. I was writing from the point of view of a child, and I needed to go back and see what sort of thing were at child height, and what sort of things would amuse a child, and to remember what it's like to drag a stick along railings and things like that, and how it feels, and those sorts of bits and pieces that you don't do as an adult. So I do revisit places, but I have also written about places that I have no personal knowledge of, and just from having done some internet research. But if I can, I get there because it does add those bits and pieces that you don't, you don't see, you don't notice otherwise because things become so everyday.
Yes, and I think you have to have enough research, not just a cursory dip into something. I have to admit that a few years ago, a friend and I tried to co-author a novel set in Havana. And our sum total of experience of Cuba was, in fact, 10 days in Havana. So it was it was not nearly enough to set a novel in any meaningful way. It would have just been wallpaper, really, had we done that. It wasn't, we knew enough that, we knew enough about the Cuban wiring because we kept falling into it in the street. And we knew that if you hung around long enough, a guy with a guitar would jump out from behind a shrub and sing Guantanamera to you and tell you that you're more beautiful than a gardenia. But we didn't really know it, and it foundered because we didn't get very far. It amused us, shall we say. I don't think it would have seriously amused any readers.
Well, what about historical events? If you're writing about events that took place in the past in one of your books, have you felt the need to go back and check, for example,
Yes.
newspaper articles about the time and so on and so forth? I mean, to what extent does that figure?
For me, I did quite a lot of that. I read some books about the Egyptian Revolution in '52, and also about the Arab Spring, because I have a scene set in 2011 in The Girls from Alexandria. And I was not there at the time. I know people who were. So I also spoke to some of them, and I watched YouTube videos.
Wow.
So for NASA's speeches, for example, I watched some of his speeches on YouTube. And I think the powerful jaw that he had, he was a very tall man with a powerful jaw and with teeth that were always on display. And then that's exactly like, what Nadia in my novel struck her most when she was a child. So it was really remembering all that. It was all nudged by YouTube videos. But yes, I had to do a bit of that, because that's history. I couldn't afford to get it wrong.
Any other thoughts or comments from anyone? Well, if not, I'd just like to say thank you very much, Carol, for having contributed your thoughts about the process of novel writing. That was all very illuminating, and I wish you success with your novels in the future. I'm sure. Have you got some in the pipeline that you're working on at the moment?
I have. And I'm always inspired by talking about books and by talking to other writers as well as readers. So, you know, it's been great being invited along this evening, and I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So I want to thank you and your colleagues at the Friends of Belsize Community Library, and of course everyone who's given up their evening and sat uncomfortably, because Zoom can be uncomfortable after a while. So I'm really grateful to all of you, and to the other writers. Good luck with your writing. Have fun.
Well, thank you for that. And just finally, to say that if anybody is interested in coming along to our next Zoom event, it'll be on the third. It's always the third Thursday. It'll be on the third Thursday in April, and it's being presented by Neil Titley, who is a writer and actor, and who will be talking about Oscar Wilde, a performance that he's done around the world over about the last 30 years or so. And that, I think, will be probably succeeded at some point in the future by him coming to talk about Hampstead, and actually the mention of the Magdala pub, which I think came from you, Jane, was it? He's set his writings about Hampstead around the Magdala pub, and that's something I think just about to be published, and he will be talking about at various venues, possibly not to Belsize again till next year maybe, but we will probably get him back. But if you want to see what he's like, come along and visit us. Same link on Thursday, I think it's the 20th of April, third Thursday in April. Anyway, thank you very much for coming along, everybody, and I wish you a pleasant rest of your evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.